Hi, everybody. Again, I'm Khalid Safari of the President National Interest Foundation. Thank you very much for coming. I know the event is right in the middle of the rush hour, the traffic, so that shows your commitment to the cause for coming at this rush hour. And for those guys driving from DC, I used to live in DC, and people from DC never drive outside the city. Whereas Bruce came all the way. And so, well, thank you, everybody. I think you came not to listen to me, to listen to our speakers, and they all have their expertise. And I think no one spent time on the ICC and ICJ more than Sam. I mean, we communicated for almost 2 months, and he was pushing for it. We're getting together lists of who could sign, people from South America, members of parliament, even embassies, South American embassies in Washington, to push for this. And it came from where no one expected, from South Africa, which was a great victory. So to discuss this, we have a good panelist. We didn't want to have 10 speakers. Actually, we invited a couple of people from outside of here. Someone couldn't make it from Philadelphia, another from New York, a very distinguished speaker with lots of experience in this field. She couldn't make it to DC. She was willing to do it via Zoom, and we thought it's not the same having the person in front of you having a oral discussion. So Sam did lots of research, has good background on the issue, and Bruce Fine have handled many cases. He represented us in one of the cases at the ICC. Went all the way to Holland,
The Hague.
The Hague, for 1 day, had very little sleep, and came back following day. So anyway, both have the experience and the background, so they will give us an idea of many questions people have. Where is this ICC, ICJ going? And there was a big question. I was reading just before this event article about countries that provide Israel with arms. Are they liable for the death and are being charged with genocide? This is a big question mark. So anyway, thank you again. I'll ask Yasmin to come and introduce our panelists, and you can come here, Bruce and Sam.
Hello, everyone. I'm Yasmin Hussein. I am originally from California, and I work in downtown DC at a big law firm. I have somewhat of a background in international law. I studied it as a student, as a law student, and some background in environmental conservation. I'm very excited to be here. Grateful to have this opportunity. It is hard to see this. My family is Syrian, so we've been through war for more than 10 years. So I understand it deeply, I feel it deeply, and I'm honored to be here to help moderate this discussion. As Khaled said, we have two wonderful panelists who have extensive background and knowledge on this case and on the situation that is happening in Gaza now. I don't have your bios on me. I'm so sorry. I don't know if we're going to pull it up.
Can you give her the bios?
I just want to make sure I don't have the wrong information.
Well, just you can just give us some idea.
Sure.
Yes.
We'll have the panelists introduce themselves.
Yes.
So, Bruce, you want to?
Just remember, nothing she's saying under oath anyway. So.
Yes. Don't quote me. Yeah, please, Bruce, would you like to introduce yourself, and then we can have Sammy introduce himself.
Okay, is the mic on here? Yes. So my name is Bruce Fine. I've been practicing international constitutional law for some 40 years. My baptism in Washington was Watergate. My first task was to investigate what were impeachable offenses after the Saturday Night Massacre. So I never was worried about challenging power. When Nixon said, "President does it, it means it's legal," I said, "No, not in the United States. That's not what happens." So I spent time in all three branches: clerk, associate deputy attorney general, general counsel of the Federal Communications Commission, counsel on the Joint Congressional Committee on Covert Arms Sales in Iran, and I regret to report that the political culture in the United States has decayed over the years. It's quite really alarming to see these stupidities and bigotries that have ascended. Congress has turned into an inkblot. Doesn't matter what party is in power. The president does anything, lies. There's no oversight, and that's why it's so important that there are groups like you who have the interest. Citizens have to make these derelicts to the Constitution pay a price, or we're going downhill, including soon we'll be at war with Iran without a declaration, for sure, to try to affect November's voting and you don't change horses in midstream. Anyway, with regard to international law, we're here today. I myself was on a committee that invited Miko Peled and Max Blumenthal over at the Capitol Hill Club. They presented a wonderful presentation about what the dynamics are in Israel that causes the extremes to take the podium, encouraged by the unconditional support that the United States has given diplomatic, intelligence, weapons. Now, a colleague raised the issue, well, are we culpable? And the answer is, in the eyes of the law, yes. If you systematically supply a belligerent with weapons, you become a co-belligerent. You're aiding and abetting war crimes or genocide. So I was a little bit surprised that South Africa didn't name the United States as a co-defendant against Israel, since we're providing all the weapons. We know exactly what's going on over there. We're helping them with intelligence. We veto various resolutions in the Security Council. The reason I suspect is that we perhaps have an ability to retaliate against countries that do things like that, that Israel doesn't have. And I'll tell you this story that arose in the aftermath of our invasion of Iraq in 2003. Brussels, Belgium at that time, had a universal jurisdiction law that enabled the Belgian private citizens to initiate criminal proceedings against those that saw it had engaged in torture or extrajudicial killings. And after we invaded, there are many indictments against Colin Powell, Bush, others. Rumsfeld, the usual suspects, to borrow from Casablanca. So the day after the indictments were brought, Donald Rumsfeld flew to Brussels and said, that law isn't repealed tomorrow, we're taking NATO out of Brussels. And the law was repealed the next day. That's how the United States runs its foreign policy. It's the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. But anyway, that's my introduction.
Thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll get more into it as the discussion goes on. I'm going to turn it over to Sam Husseini, or Husseini. If you can go ahead and introduce yourself and give us a background. Thank you.
Thank you. My primary background is as a journalist. I work for a nonprofit and try to get good information out. I primarily now write on Substack because, as you might have noticed, the major media are not what they profess to be and haven't been during most of my life. And if anything, they're getting worse. So my writing is at husseini.substack.com. And I think Bruce is on Substack as well. It's a good, independent writer platform. A couple of things. Today, I don't know if you want more about me or if you, I'll just, so much of my work on this is overshadowed by generally U.S. foreign policy, not just simply this current crisis, how it fits together with the Iraq invasion and so on, and long-term U.S. designs for the Middle East, along with Israel, obviously. Today, there was a UN Security Council meeting, getting into some of the substance of this, and they didn't pass any resolution. They didn't even put forward a resolution, so there was no U.S. veto. It was a lot of talk, and ultimately no action. However, the South Africans made a statement, and it was probably the most interesting statement. And they did, among other things, I don't think they named the U.S. precisely, but they indicated that other countries who are backing Israel's actions face culpability. I don't have the exact quote yet. My video guy is clipping the videos right now as I speak. in order to try to get that around the internet. And that's largely how I started, really juicing up my work after October 7th. I had been going to the State Department briefings, and I've generally been going to briefings at the press club where I used to have a small office, and elsewhere, and trying to ask the tough question that other journalists don't ask, and finding other ways to do that. For a while, I even, before I discovered that I could have a weekend, I would go to the Sunday morning talk shows with a cameraman in tow and ask them tough questions as they were walking out, because they got to physically walk out of the building. And you would have CNN send a camera crew in front of ABC and ask the Secretary of State as they walked out the same stupid, banal question that he just got asked in the studio. Well, I would go there and ask an actual tough question and then post that on the internet with some effect. Over the last couple of years, I've been getting into the State Department. And after October 7th, they wouldn't call on me at all. It was always an uphill struggle for them calling on me. But after October 7th, I wouldn't. So the first hearing that they had after October 7th, I just started hollering out questions. And I survived the day, and I put them on notice. And I got very quiet thank yous from mainstream reporters, from huge outlets worth billions of dollars, who themselves didn't say a word during the whole, didn't even raise their hands. I'm raising my hand the whole time. Then the understudy came in November, and I think I pushed them to have him come on, because I sent them emails mocking them for saying that they have a press briefing every day and they're so transparent. I was like, no, you don't have a press briefing every day. When Blinken is out of town, you don't have a press briefing, and he's out of town a lot. So cut out this false narrative. And then they immediately had the following week, when Blinken was out of town, they had the understudy in, and he called on me for 4 days. And I raised, among other things, the possibility of legal action and the ICJ action and so on. The ICJ action was envisioned by Francis Boyle, who was a longtime PLO advisor, legal advisor, very close with Haider Abdel-Shafi, and he has long pushed for this. I had heard of him talking about it, but I didn't really look into it until 10 years ago, the 2014 assault on Gaza. And then I really dug into this, and I wrote an article, a global legal intifada. And I noted all these countries are calling it genocide, but they're not invoking the convention. Why is that? So immediately when October 7th happened, I immediately dusted that off and started writing chunks of that and banging away and banging away and banging away. And I should tell you, South Africa was one of my first choices to do this, but I'll get into that more.
That was one of the questions I was going to ask. I noticed someone mentioned that was very interesting. South Africa brought this case. Can one or either of you comment on that and let us know why South Africa?
Well, I can't quite be sure as to why, but let me give you some of the backstory. I mean, I talked to Khaled and to other people who might have had connections with Arab American communities in Latin America. Could we get them to get their governments to do it? Everybody that I knew, I had a bit of a relationship with Desmond Tutu. He wrote, I drafted an article. His last article that Desmond Tutu wrote was calling on Biden, the then incoming Biden administration, to come to term to admit that Israel has a nuclear weapons arsenal and then cut off funding for Israel. I drafted the article, Desmond Tutu signed it. I tried to get the New York Times and LA Times and Washington Post publish it. Desmond Tutu, the last major figure of the 20th century, nobody would publish this article. I finally got it into The Guardian. It was published in late December 2020, before Biden went into office, and almost a year to the day when Desmond Tutu died. So that had helped me establish a lot of very good connections to South Africa and activists there and so on. They had their cabinet voted to cut off relations with Israel in, I think, early November, or that their parliament did, and then their cabinet took up the matter and was considering doing it. That and I understood from people secondhand that they were also considering invoking the Genocide Convention. So this would be late November, and they didn't do it. They didn't cut off relations as the parliament told them to, and they didn't announce what I tried to sell as a compromise measure of invoking the Genocide Convention. And I was completely heartbroken because I thought that they would, and then kept pushing Latin American countries at that point. And I got a lot of people, a lot of former, a lot of Nobel Prize winners and so on to be contacting the South African as well as other governments as well. Looking back on it now, I think that they probably initiated the process at that point in late November, and they spent a month making a very serious legal argument. My other strain on this was that I had put John Dugard on a news release. He's a very prominent South African lawyer. That's how I knew him as, and he was former rapporteur on Palestine. He, when I talked to him in very late October, I told, he gave me some good quotes about Israel being above the law and so on, but he didn't know, he didn't seriously consider invoking the Genocide Convention. But I kept sending him material about it. And then I was very delighted that he was the senior lawyer for South Africa when they announced it. He was the one dressed in bright pink, if you recall the hearing. So I don't know if that had an effect as well, because he was the actual legal brains behind it, and I think he was dismissive of it in late October, and at some point he obviously turned and decided to back them.
I mean, there's another element. I don't know whether it had any lingering effects, but during apartheid, South Africa was very, very close with Israel, and Israel was helping it try to develop its nuclear weapons. Remember the Kalahari Desert information we had that we covered up. So South Africa, post Mandela, doesn't have historically, warm relations with Israel. Otherwise, things got a little bit, unusual after the International Court of Justice in the case called the Gambia versus Myanmar made clear that a nation can sue in the International Court of Justice for a violation of international law, even though it is not the victim. It is because constructively, since it's a universal norm that's violated, the whole world suffers. And that opened up the possibility of any nation in the world can sue for genocide, some other violations, crimes against humanity or otherwise. I think I would make this observation that's very important. We're trying to talk about the ICC, the ICJ. They don't have any enforcement capability. They don't have the Air Force. They don't have any Army. They don't have any Navy. Whatever they pronounce, you obey or not. I remember when we were trying to overthrow the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, we were cited for violating international law and planting mines in harbors. We told the courts, well, so what? Did anything happen in the United States? Nothing. It doesn't mean that it isn't worth going anyway. It's important in my judgment to set even a verbal norm that we denounce this. And that's why I believe that in the ICJ ruling last Friday, which is very, very muffled, if you read the words closely, they don't say there's a violation of the Genocide Convention. They say, make sure that you don't violate the Genocide Convention. I read, well, that was an obligation of Israel ever since it signed the Genocide Convention. There's nothing new about that. Because I believe the ICJ knew that if they ordered or found genocide and you have to cease, the military occupation and attacks, the siege, the denying the water, the food, the medical, that it wouldn't be obeyed. And it would make more pronounced what's kind of less not known, that it's paper tiger, that when push comes to shove, you have a big power, whatever they say is going to be ignored. The same thing is true even, and I mean, in South Africa had kind of a bloody nose too with the ICC. Let me explain briefly for a lay audience. The ICJ's jurisdiction is only to entertain suits between nations. That's it. Natural persons can't bring suit there. It's nations, and it's not criminal. No one goes to prison for losing an ICJ case. The ICC is quite different. The ICC entertains only prosecutions against natural persons. That's it. Not corporations, not countries. But it also lacks, like the ICJ, it lacks enforcement power. I had been involved when the ICC had indicted Omar Bashir of Sudan for genocide, Darfur. And there was an arrest warrant outstanding. And he was visiting South Africa. And they kept saying, you need to arrest him. South Africa did nothing. He got on a plane, escaped back to Khartoum. He's still free today, although he ultimately got ousted for other reasons. He's never been sent back to the ICC for prosecution. Sudan right now is in upheaval anyway because there's a civil war. But anyway, it's important to know they have it's not like a domestic court. They have no enforcement authority. The potential enforcement authority is the UN Security Council, which could conclude, because under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, they do have authority to go to war, to impose universal embargoes on countries. But they have the unilateral veto power, either the big five, China, Russia, France, Great Britain, United States. The United States would clearly veto any kind of sanction against Israel that came out, that attempted to be imposed because they may lose the final decision in the International Court of Justice, or even the ICC for that matter. And for that reason, these courts need to be thought of not like we think about the US Supreme Court issues a ruling, that things actually change because of a ruling, but more just another act of diplomacy. And that's why when you look at how these courts operate, you go back to Thucydides and the history of the Peloponnesian War. The strong do what they wish and the weak suffer what they must. It's very harsh, but that's true. That's how it happens. I mean, we have right now, for instance, Vladimir Putin indicted by the ICC. Does anybody really expect he's going to be tried for the ICC? Has he ever changed his behavior because of that?
He can't travel, apparently.
Well, I'm not sure whether he wasn't likely to travel anyway. He's gone the Magnitsky Act and all these other travel limitations. But but if we go beyond just the jurisdiction of the ICC and go to the Genocide Convention itself and the history of its interpretation, it's very simple. I mean, certainly the prima facie case that Israel is committing genocide is overwhelming. In Section 2 of the Genocide Convention, it defines genocide as including, and I'm almost quoting, deliberately creating conditions of life calculated to destroy physically a people in whole or in part. Conditions of life. And we have, among others, the defense minister saying what the siege is about. No food, no water, no medicine, no shelter. I mean, I don't know anybody who can survive without food or water. And that's not an isolated statement, never been retracted. You have many others saying we should get rid of all Palestinians in Gaza. So that's the element of intent. What do you think the siege is going to lead to? You know that you're going to try to physically destroy these people. And again, they're bombing hospitals, UN schools, journalists. I think it killed almost 70, 80 journalists already. These are not possibly military targets. So to claim that this is a genocide it's about as simple a case you can imagine, because they clearly, the goal is get rid of them, and they've resorted not only to the siege with regard to humanitarian aid, but the rockets and the bombs and destruction, and 90% of the population has been displaced. Children are dying because they have disease. They don't have medical care anymore. They're starving. And some experts estimate by the end of the year, 500,000 Palestinians will starve to death unless something changes with regard to the access. And remember, it's genocide even if it's an attempt. You don't have to succeed in order for the crime to occur. Or the conspiracy is also a violation under the Genocide Convention. And it's remarkable to me that some of these defenders poo-pooing the claim of genocide including Tony Blinken. I mean, have you ever read the Genocide Convention? You know what we're talking about? It's like they just eliminate all the things that are going on in Gaza. Those are not conditions of life calculated to destroy the people in whole or in part. Then I don't know what is. I mean, if this isn't genocide, the Genocide Convention is a hoax. It's a very, very clear case. There is not any requirement in proving genocide that the number reach a certain kind of threshold. In Srebrenica, there was found to be a genocide, as like 700 Muslim men were killed. That was held to be a genocide. Say, because the convention makes it clear, trying to destroy people physically in whole or in part. Got to read in part means something separate than in whole. Because I've read stories say, well, if Israel really wanted to commit genocide, they'd kill them all already. You know, that's not required to be genocide, in part. So it's unfortunate that I think the Congress of the United States is kind of a satellite of the Knesset in Israel. You know, whatever Netanyahu wants, they passed a resolution. I think one of the worst ever, saying that anti-Zionism is indistinguishable from anti-Semitism. The ones who are most vocal against Zionism are the most pure Jews. It is the rabbis. And this goes back hundreds of years because they understand Judaism is a religion. It's not a state. And they understand that you can be a Jew if you believe in the Torah and the 613 mitzvahs. It doesn't matter where you live, whether you live in Austria, United States, you live in Chad, in Tunisia, or Morocco, or Thailand, or any place. You're a Jew because it is a way of life in which you worship God, no matter where you are, and you believe in these precepts that have been handed down by the rabbis. And they believe that Zionism is idolatry because you're worshiping a state, not a religion. You're not worshiping God anymore. You're worshiping a state. They believe you're contaminating and corrupting Judaism. These are the highest trained rabbis who spend their whole life doing nothing but reading the Old Testament. Are they anti-Semites? Really? I mean, you can imagine. Think of the members of Congress. I have to go up there most of the time. I understand as well. But I shake your head. You think they know anything about Judaism? They probably don't even know what Zionism means. They know who writes political checks for them. They say, okay, you vote for X? Okay, that is. Where I got the signal, I trust them. So I cast my vote then. I mean, it's lunacy, to be candid. It's lunacy. Anti-Semitism because you're against Zionism. This is what the purest of Jews are that.
Back to the case at
Yes.
hand. I think that it's important to view the ICJ ruling not as a godsend, not view South Africa as this savior knight, but not to dismiss it in any way, shape, or form either. It's very significant, and it is a tool that can and should be used. You say, Bruce, there's no enforcement. Supreme Court doesn't have any enforcement either, right?
Well,
You know,
the difference
and-
is that the president is obligated under Article 2 of the Constitution, and Brown v. Board was enforced because Eisenhower had to send troops to make sure those 9 little girls got into high school in Little Rock.
Right, but that took a while for that kind of power to be. I mean, you had country after country at the Security Councils today say ICJ rulings are binding on a country, and the ruling did say, per the Genocide Convention, Israel shall stop activities, including
No,
killing.
I'm not denying that. I'm just saying that
So-
there isn't any, that I don't think it's fair to equate the enforcement authority that goes along with the U.S. Supreme Court decision with what the ICJ does. It's the ideal world. The fact is that we all in this room expect U.S. Supreme Court issued a decision, abortion, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, absolute immunity. It is going to be enforced.
Correct me if I'm
Nobody plans their life on the idea that if the ICJ makes a decision, we can count on that being enforced.
Right.
That's the difference.
But I mean, I think part of this is a process of a different kind of world happening here, right? I mean, you know more American history than I do, I'm sure. At the beginning, it wasn't clear that Supreme Court decisions would be so respected.
Well, we've never had, at least at present, I'm speaking 235 years.
I'm saying that the nature of the decisions by the court early on in America's history were rather delicate because they were afraid. As if I'm remembering my AP
John
history,
Marshall,
exactly.
Well, yeah, John Marshall made his decisions, and sometimes he went off subject matter jurisdiction. But I'm just saying, in the United States, and certainly today, whether you say it was more fragile because we had very, very embryonic institutions, so we didn't have the history. We now have 234 years of history.
Correct.
Nobody, for a second, certainly in the legal world, thinks Supreme Court decides something that we'll just ignore it. That's not going to happen.
Agreed.
That's not the expectation of the ICJ.
Right. But I think that this is a new world attempting. This is not just about Palestine. This is about a global, meaningful rule of law, and not just simply the US as an empire saying, we're going to invoke this rule now and we're going to invoke that rule later. Part of what I think we're going to see potentially is there's a deadlock now clearly at the Security Council. There is an ongoing General Assembly move regarding uniting for peace, which is a mechanism that the General Assembly can use to attempt to assert its power. Again, there's going to be a question of power and the ability to have enforcement of that. But they can do tangible things. They can suspend Israel from activities at the UN General Assembly. They can admit Palestine as a full member of the General Assembly, not just simply an observer state. They can set up a tribunal, potentially. All prior tribunals have been set up by the Security Council on Rwanda and Yugoslavia. There's no law against the General Assembly setting up a tribunal. It's going to take intestinal fortitude from various countries. And I think we need to still be pushing countries to be issuing declarations of intervention at the ICJ, backing up South Africa's case. You mentioned universal jurisdiction and how the US gutted that in Belgium. And it's attempted to boss around other countries. I think there needs to be a process of reasserting, and not just among European countries, but why can't Brazil and other countries start asserting universal jurisdiction and then putting war criminals on notice that they're going to get arrested if they set foot in their country. And this also puts pressure on the ICC to actually go after individuals. I mean, the ICC has been a complete con job so far. I mean, part of the reason that I went down this path of going to the ICJ is that I understood from legal scholars that it could actually have, bear fruit. And because the ICC, the International Criminal Court, had so flagrantly pushed aside Palestine especially, but also anything that would be critical of the US or NATO, would go after African leaders, and then you had their prosecutor go to the Rafah crossing and say, as if to say, I'm the cop on the beat, send your complaints to me, and then everybody fell for that. It was a con job to get people to go down a false path. So now he's on the spot. Why is he not doing anything? I don't think that there's a direct way of ousting him. But I think that there should be a hue and cry to really put an immense amount of pressure on him.
Well, listen, I don't disagree with aspirations. I'm just trying to describe the reality. And we would want to try to change it. The reality was when the chief prosecutor began to investigate United States war crimes in Afghanistan, because although we're not a signatory to the ICC, Afghanistan is, and if a crime occurs in a signatory state, you can investigate it.
During Trump.
Yeah, we said, we put her on notice, you know what, you're never coming to the United States again. We're never going to cooperate with you. You're going to cut off all the money. And she said, okay, drop the case. I'm just describing reality. And in my view, too, we all have limited resources and focus. We got to get the United States is every bit as complicit as Israel in all of these horrors, right? And we do our own, like we did in Iraq. We turned Libya into a wilderness and called it peace. It's still in chaos today. And we need, we're citizens of the United States. This is happening in our name. And a lot of it can end if we get Congress and scream and yell, no more money, no more weapons. And that power and influence will have effect immediately, a lot more than the ICJ. I remember the last time there was the public really spoke up is Obama in 2013 wanted to ask for a declaration of war against Syria, chemical weapons, right? The emails came in, flood, even the super rocks, even people like Tom Cotton and Ted Cruz said, no way, we're not voting. Even Lindsey Graham, and Lindsey Graham truly is deranged. His latest words are, hit Iran and hit Iran hard right now. I don't know what he thinks the next step's going to be.
And I'm sure my family
but that's-
would be down too.
Yeah. But anyway, that's something that we in the we're citizens. We're right and go meet, complain. It doesn't change overnight for sure, but they respond to that. The members do, especially if you write something out as more than a form letter. And the United States is responsible for a huge portion of all of these violations of international law, which we ignore. And you talk about, we set the precedent in Nicaragua, the mining the harbor. Said, so what? We don't care what a judgment is. We're not going to comply, and we didn't comply. We said, "Oh, fine."
But
It's a scrap of paper. I'm not saying that you don't complain about it, but I'm just saying there are other vehicles, and the one staring us in the face is the United States of America. You know how we ended the Vietnam War? Congress finally had the backbone to put in a resolution that says no monies to the United States shall be used to fight any combat over Indochina. August 15th, 1973, end of the war. Took a long time. They had already repealed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And I just think we need much more pressure and denunciation of the Congress of the United States to keep voting all this money and passing these crazy resolutions. Really? I mean, we can't criticize Israel? Then we can criticize our own government, but we're off bounds to criticize a foreign country? Doesn't that seem a little bit lunatic? Anyway, that's where we are. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I got word that we were going to open the floor up for questions soon. Just to wrap up this interesting discussion, it's what I'm hearing is Sam is saying there's going to be more credence to the international community now moving forward. And what Bruce is saying is historically it's been a regional, the United States has a lot of power and they are supporting Israel. But the tides could turn. There is a shift. That's what Sam's saying. There could be a shift and we have to put a lot of hope into the ICJ case and international law. So
we have to use it as much as possible.
Yeah,
And
it's
I'm not
important.
against that. I'm just wanted is forecasting, and you say we all have limited time and resources. What is the return on investment? And right now, I think the greatest return is go up to the members' Congress office. Wait a minute, we don't want no money. You won't want our resources implicating the United States in genocide. That's going to have a lot faster effect on Israel. Israel couldn't be doing this without our money, without our props, without our weapons, or without our intelligence. They couldn't. And that stops it. We have the ICJ decision. Has anyone noticed any difference in what's happening in Gaza?
Yes,
Right.
yes, I have. May I?
Yeah, go ahead.
What have we seen in Gaza? We've seen a dramatic escalation in the explicitness of the U.S. assistance of the genocidal assaults. We saw them immediately unplug UNRWA. So
It got worse, yeah.
yeah, it got worse. It got worse because they are a behemoth empire and feel like they're not getting their way, so they're going to, throw their weight around even more to fight this. We were noting the evidence against UNRWA seems was extracted by torture, and that's exactly how the U.S. got into the Iraq War. They used tortured evidence in order to fabricate the link between Iraq and Kuwait. So there's a whole series of tools that the empire uses, and we just have to parse through all of them. I think that this empowers people to go up to Congress and say, we demand that you cut off funding for Israel, empowered by this thing that happened on the world stage, however much major media attempted to suppress it, and it's also rule of law.
Rule-based international order.
Well,
we preach it, but we don't follow it.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, but
Only
members
others.
of Congress should do so, as you've eloquently said, in terms of impeachment.
I-
South Africa abided by their
I
obligations.
think
Members of
I'm
Congress
not
should as
boasting.
well.
I have drafted more articles of impeachment than anyone else in the United States for all these presidents who've all done these illegal wars. It's very hard to get. Walter Jones was the last one from North Carolina who would all have the vertebrae to do anything. Everyone else up there, the president, he's not going to build a road in my district. He's not going to build a hospital. He may do a tweet. I mean, you can't imagine how anemic these members are. But I certainly, and I don't want to at all suggest that we should cease in trying to argue for a rule of law. But I think the biggest impact is the United States, because we're the example, we got the money, and we're the ones who set the precedents for other people to do things. I said when Putin went into Ukraine, I said, what was his precedent? Same way we went into Iraq. What's the difference between Putin and Ukraine and the United States and Iraq? We invented, we didn't even have a consensus that there were WMD. George Tenet, who was then CIA director, the one who said, we have a slam dunk on WMD. He said, well, nobody really knew why we're going into Iraq, but we had the least common denominator was, why don't we say that it's WMD? No one really believed it, because it was based upon people whose reputation for truthfulness was like Pinocchio's or George Santos, one or the other. I'm not sure which one's worse. So that's where we were. And I'm thinking that without sustained, and we all have the First Amendment right to petition for redress of grievances. That is constitutional protection. I was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and an early hero was someone named William Lloyd Garrison. He in Boston began the Liberator magazine in 1833. It was calculated to denounce slavery, covenant with hell. He was first tarred and feathered, and everyone laughed. Congress had the gag rule; they wouldn't entertain any petitions for abolition for years, until John Quincy Adams finally got rid of it after 10 years. But he persisted, and he was there when the 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865, ending slavery. He ended the Liberator magazine. But in some sense, we have to be resolved like him. This is not going to turn around quickly, because we've been this downward descent for decades. This is not the first time that this happened. You talk about the war issue. Harry Truman says it's a police action in Korea. We're almost at nuclear war with China. 3 million troops there, a police action? What are you with the biggest lie there ever was? No, there may be the bigger lies too. But I think the important thing is we can never stop failing to try. That is our luxury. We all have, I say, lottery tickets here tonight. We're not in Gaza. We have freedom. We have freedom to speak and think and organize and protest. We got to utilize the lottery ticket. And that's how it's done. We don't have the luxury to be wasting time, because the deaths and the killing and the misery out there that you can see on TV, vastly more acute than I hope any of us experience in a lifetime. It's too urgent to ignore.
Thank you so much. I needed to hear that. We have a lot of power as Americans. We are funding a lot of this war. It's disheartening, and especially if we have heritage or family over there, it's very hard to see. So thank you so much for reminding us, and thank you to Sam. I was informed that we have some questions in the audience, so go ahead, please.
We have a microphone. Where's the microphone?
We'll get you mic'd up. Do you want to use mine? There you go.
Thank you so much for this informative session. My question is very simple. What's next? There was that media victory against Israel, semi-victory if you may, but what's next? Now, is there a procedure we follow? That's it. Thank you.
Go ahead.
As I see it, and Bruce might different, there are two aspects to what's next. One, what's next is directly from the ICJ. The ICJ said, report in a month. You, Israel, report to us that how you have implemented our orders in 1 month. It's possible that South Africa or potentially some other state could jump in and say, before the month is up, Israel is not implementing what you told it to do. That we interpret your statements to say it should stop killing, and it's not stopping killing, and you need to deal with it before the month is out. That could happen. I don't know that South Africa will be that brave, but that's conceivable. It could well be referred to the Security Council. They had a meeting today. They talked a lot about it. They didn't vote. I assume they didn't vote because the US would veto anything with teeth in it. It's possible that some countries are going to push things at the Security Council, compelling a US veto, which would then potentially bring in an unprecedented coalescence of the General Assembly to try to wrestle some control over the issue and do the steps that I outlined, getting Israel out of, suspending Israel from participation in the General Assembly, admitting Palestine as a full member, and setting up a tribunal. Those are, in terms of the process of this thing, from my point of view, that's what's next. But there's other what's next. This should tremendously empower, for example, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, right? It has a major leverage from the International Court of Justice that tars Israel, and it helps expose Israel from the highest legal body in the world, and that should empower it. It should empower activists here in the United States to go from that media moment to not say, but okay, it's horrible that the bombing is continuing, but South Africa did this, now what can I do? And how can I interact with members of Congress? How can I interact with the company that I work for, and so on, so that more people become more assertive in terms of other ways of stopping this?
I think the next most important act is trying to prevent Congress from appropriating any more money for Israel, or at least conditioning the money on compliance with the most primitive standards of the laws of war. It's caught up right now because there's a logjam over immigration reform, if you want to call it that, through the maneuvering for November 2024. And if you want to try to forecast Biden's actions, 100%, I've been in Washington long, 100% of his thinking is, to the extent he still thinks, sometimes he looks like a mummy, is how will this impact the November voting? That's all he's thinking about. He may miscalculate, but I can guarantee you, I've been in politics here. That's the only thing that when he gets memo, he says, how does this impact November? He cares about nothing else other than being reelected. On that score, he's not different than other politicians. They're all sociopaths. But there is an opportunity, I think, and there's been some movement, at least by some of the legislators, at least require conditions to be placed on the aid. Right now, you can use it for whatever you want. Waiver of all the limitations supposed to be used only for defensive purposes, but we waive every conceivable law under the sun in providing the weapons to Israel. And I say that makes it more glaring that we are aiding and abetting crime because we're not even attempting by law to try to restrict the use of the munitions to uses that don't violate the laws of war, not used genocidally. And I'm just saying, from my perspective, and I'm certainly saying that it can be flawed, that the optimal use of time is just hammering your member of Congress and writing and saying, we don't want this, this is bad. Some of you, I don't know, you walk into the district office. If this continues, you may be losing my vote. That's what they care about. I know it always looks like if you're just one, it doesn't matter, right? The problem is way beyond what one individual can do. And all I can say is that progress in civilization been made at all, because at some time, we don't know when, someplace, we don't know where, somebody stood up maybe thousands of years ago and said, slavery is evil, it's got to stop. Person disappears from the planet. We don't know the most obscure person in the history of the world. We all owe that person a huge debt, maybe even more than Socrates, because he did the right thing even though there was no consequence to his benefit whatsoever. We have to, as citizens, act with that same spirit. That's the movement forward.
Thank you. Do we have more questions? Okay, I see gentlemen in the back, and then we'll get you next. Thank you.
Thank you. Could you maybe comment on the lawsuit that was filed by I believe the Constitutional Center against Biden, Blinken, and Secretary Austin, and the possibility, maybe even, is there any other ways in the U.S. for other legal venue for lawsuits against whether individuals, companies, or otherwise? Just a brief comment, since Bruce was
Well, yeah. I've read the complaint. So it's filed in the District Court of Northern District of California before Judge White. And I think they had an argument on motion to dismiss. It's a very, very difficult argument to make because it's trying to get an injunction against the president from violating the laws of war. I mean, how are you going to enforce that? The laws of war, gathering the evidence. I think it's useful as a platform.
So there's an enforcement problem here too.
No, I mean, in defining, not an enforcement problem, even defining what the violation is.
Okay.
Because they're just saying that in going forward, just comply. He needs to be in compliance with international law. It's that you can't enforce a norm unless you can describe what the norm is. Right? So I think that the judge will say, these terrible things are happening, but you don't have, and the problem they have also is standing. There's a requirement in Article 3 of the Constitution that you have to show the violation that's ongoing is causing you concrete injury. Just going to say, well, okay, causing a lot of concrete injury to everybody in Gaza is real too, but you don't have any standing because it's not causing you harm other than you don't want your country to violate the law. And the U.S. Supreme Court, unfortunately, has regularly said that's not standing.
No,
And maybe you're paying taxes.
The families from Gaza are involved in the lawsuit. There is standing. That issue is settled.
These are the other plaintiffs you say are where?
The families from Gaza.
In Gaza, and
individuals, Americans who have families, who lost families in Gaza, yes.
so they are suing. They're suing on behalf of the estates, on behalf of the estates, and they're claiming that what Biden has done has violated their. Unfortunately, the U.S. Constitution doesn't really travel abroad. That's why it was a very famous case, Ricky Camarena. He was somebody who was. We violated Fourth Amendment rights in Mexico, and the court said, well, sorry, Fourth Amendment doesn't go abroad. Very, very hard to make a claim, if it doesn't happen in the United States. That's, I'm not defending it, but that's what the law is. That's my prediction of what's going to happen.
What about the Torture Victim Protection Act, which is a civil lawsuit for anybody violating human rights outside the U.S.?
That, the Torture Victim Protection Act applies when the violation occurs under color of foreign law. So it may seem odd, but when the United States authorizes the torture is complicit in it, the law doesn't apply. It has to be under color of a different law. And then you have to get personal jurisdiction over the perpetrator. But obviously, Joe Biden, the people that he sued, they're acting pursuant to U.S. law. So I don't think the TVPA is going to apply in these circumstances.
Just a brief kind of announcement, maybe since Bruce is emphasizing the fact that we need to contact Congress. There is an effort, which is a grassroots effort. So far, they've reached about 33 states. These are groups formed on WhatsApp. There's one here for Virginia. These are people who call Congress every single day. From Virginia, there's about 100 and some calls every day that are made by these people. I run a group from Connecticut. We make about 125 calls a day. So each person in the group commits to calling their senators. So that's 2 calls, and their representative. So that's 3 calls per person. Yesterday, we crossed the threshold of 7,000 calls across the U.S. Per day. And it's growing. And anybody who wants to join, at least Virginia, since you are from Virginia, I have the link and the code so you can immediately join the group and start making calls.
Well, I very much applaud what you're doing. I think it's very admirable. It's what it means to be an American.
Thank you so much. We had a question.
Believe it or not,
here.
it was actually the same exact
Same
question
thing.
about extending it to the U.S. Just figuring out what is it that we can use in terms of laws, whether it's under human rights, whether it's under violation of certain, laws. Munji and I work actually on the Libyan case against the Haftar, and we've found a lot of ways that we can use to try to get some of these human rights, violations in civil suits, of course, but at least there's legal proceedings that can develop. And
I mean,
I'm
one of the
wondering if
most
you can-
important things, I've been involved in many of those kinds of cases. I have a TVPA case right now in Texas. Is Congress needs to amend the TVPA to make it clear that there is personal jurisdiction over any defendant, because a violation of torture or extrajudicial killing prohibition is a universal crime. It's a crime against all mankind. Because right now, unless there's the fortuity of the perpetrator somehow coming to the United States, it's very, very difficult to ever get personal jurisdiction over the worst of the worst. And after all, I mean, when they were debating the TVPA, the members of Congress were citing leaders like Ayatollah Khomeini, Gaddafi, as the type of people who are committing torture against their own citizens and needed to be sanctioned. But those are the people you want to, but you can't get them now. They're head of state immunities and all sorts of other immunities that courts invent because they're in the business of docket control, So if they can get rid of a case, they will for technical reasons. But Congress can change that. Another reason why, Congress needs to be approached and give teeth. Congress could create liability everywhere, where right now there's just huge lacuna. There's all sorts of technical reasons why the court won't go into those places. And they don't even have oversight hearings anymore, which is ridiculous. You'd figure that before we would appropriate all of the staggering billions to send to Israel, we at least have hearings and listen to both sides, see what's happening. How are weapons going to be used? No, they didn't have a single Palestinian voice on the hearings. It was just AIPAC. All come in. I mean, it really is bad. That maybe I'm diverting a little bit. I'm going to Stefanik's now famous hearing with the presidents of MIT and Harvard and
UPenn.
Penn. Yeah. Okay. So ask the question, the famous or the infamous questions, what do you do with a student who calls for genocided Jews? I've written and I went up to these. You need to say, what authority do you have as a member of Congress? Point to the provision in the United States Constitution that empowers you to ask that question. You're investigating our code of conduct. We're a private university. What's the power of Congress to even ask the question? The Supreme Court made it very clear during cases during McCarthy era. You have to have a legitimate legislative purpose. What is the legitimate legislative purpose? You don't have authority to regulate our code of conduct. What is it? She'd been stunned I'm sure she's never read the Constitution whatsoever. So I'm not answering the question. You know, it's like, when did you stop beating your wife, or your Fifth Amendment communist or whatever during the McCarthy years? And then the second thing is, the answers were perfectly correct. It was a disgrace that they backed down. You have a right, as Justice Holmes said, the most important speech to protect is the speech that you hate. That free speech does its best work when it agitates and causes people to become angered because you're shaking at their most deep convictions. At one time, the deep conviction that women were witches and needed to be burned. We need to change that deep conviction, but somebody had to say it. You know, we're not infallible. That's why we have free speech. That's why we always are searching for new information, and we discredit old ideas and come in with new ones, new understandings. It's not permanent. But in the universities, the fact that they fired, they quit, and they leave under a cloud. The other one was gay was for alleged plagiarism. But the fact was that then she apologized. Apologized for what? University is supposed to be places where speech prevails. You know, sticks and stones will break my bones. Words will never hurt me. Yeah, I can deal with stuff. You know, as long as you're peaceful and call me whatever names you want, that's okay. But we're engaged in dialogue. That's how you exchange ideas. And said that's what it means in the United States. That's what Voltaire said. I may disagree with you, but I defend your right to say it with my life. You know, this is not the era of Thomas de Torquemada. I myself have been various times boycotted or censored for other things, had nothing to do with what I was going to speak on, so I have some personal experience with this kind of lunacy. But that's an example why, and I pointed out as well, I thought you should be against all genocides. Why you only care about students calling for genocide of Jews, but not genocide of Palestinians or genocide of Biafrans or Uyghurs or anyone else? Did AIPAC feed you the question? You don't care about genocide, except that Jews are the only ones that you care about. It was so obviously orchestrated. In the weak, anemic response, I said, "Where's Edward R. Murrow?" You know, calling out McCarthy. We don't have any Edward R. Murrows anymore. Maybe Sam is here. He doesn't quite have the microphone that Edward R. Murrow had on CBS, however. So that's where we are. But again, I want to applaud everybody who's here. Keep up the work. You'll never regret a single moment that you devoted to doing the right thing.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I have two questions actually that might have political reasoning on your side. First one is that away from the veto power that the US has and the UN Security Council, when we talk about the General Assembly, as Sam mentioned before, South Africa was barred or suspended from membership in the General Assembly since 1974 until they dismantled the apartheid regime, maybe 2 decades later, and that didn't need any veto, any Security Council, and they had even less numbers of majority than we have now in the General Assembly, yet nobody can suspend or bar the Israeli delegation from being, as a punishment, from being part of the General Assembly and their committees. That happened in 1974 for same South Africa. The second one is why Palestinian Authority did not raise that issue with the ICJ of the genocide, and instead of South Africa. In 2018, the ICJ accepted a case from Palestine as a signatory of the Vienna Treaty for embassies, and they raised it against the US for relocating the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And that was when Trump decided that in 2017, they did it in 2018, and it took them 3 years waiting in the row for the ICJ to decide on it. But only once Biden came to office, And the ICJ decided for them that they are going to hear it in June 1st, 2021. The Palestinian Authority came April 2021 and said, sorry, we changed our mind. We would like to indefinitely postpone the case. So is it the case? Is it the same that the Palestinian Authority did not take the case of genocide against Israel because of the same pressure from the administration?
Can I answer this?
Yeah.
I have a personal experience with this. There was a member of the Palestinian Authority, high-ranking gentleman in Washington, in the U.S. a month ago. I asked him this question, and he said, we can't. The U.S. promised us to return the support and money under the condition we don't raise any of these issues at the UN or any international organization. So they're basically blackmailing them. They also have some problems, legal problems, they look over. There's an issue, there's a judgment in New York against the PLO that was old over, I think, a Jewish American family that had their daughter killed in Jerusalem. And they sued the PLO and the Arab Bank in Ramallah, and they won the case. That case been frozen. There's a judgment of 600 million. They threatened them, they will enforce all these laws. That's why they shut them off. So the PLO basically cannot do anything. This is half of the questions.
Yeah.
We can ask the rest.
So the first question was related to the ICJ.
The General Assembly.
Oh, the General
The
Assembly.
Assembly.
Oh, they did suspend South
Suspend.
Africa because of the apartheid policy until Mandela was released,
Yeah.
and then they regained it. So they certainly have the ability to suspend any nation for chronic violation of provisions of the principles of the United Nations Charter. And that's the only time it's ever been exercised.
No, I think it was exercised against Yugoslavia as well.
No, well, it was Yugoslavia, or it was
Well,
broken up after.
while it was because the Genocide Convention was invoked against them as well, and Yugoslavia for a time lost its ability to participate in the General Assembly.
And that was before it had all become unglued and fallen into six.
I believe so.
members.
I believe so. So that is something that can and should be done
Yeah.
either by Palestine, or if it can't
Any
or
Arab country.
won't by
Because
any
at
other
that
country.
time, actually, Algeria did it, was presiding General Assembly in 74. It was Bouteflika. And the Algerian took care of the whole issue.
We have one more question in the center.
Bruce, the Israel in their defense in front of the court said that it's Egypt controlling the subsidies going to Gaza, and until now Egypt did not present counter argument to the court. Is there any time after which that Egypt cannot present, or Egypt should present directly to the court saying no, Israel forced us to do 1, 2, 3, it is not up to us to prevent the supplies from going into Gaza?
Well, I think Israel has the ability, if they want, to have as much humanitarian aid going into Gaza at once. The idea that it's constrained by Egypt, I think, is false. Of course, Egypt's not a party to the case, so the ICJ can't order Egypt to do anything. It can order Israel to do something because they are a party, and they have ordered Israel to increase the humanitarian flow. And Rafah border crossing is not the only conceivable way you can get into Gaza. If you wanted to make it happen, you could make it happen. Look what the United States did in Berlin with the Berlin airlift. We wanted to get the food there, even though there's Soviet tanks or whatever in the interim, it got in. Nobody starved in Berlin. If that was the desire of Israel, I guarantee you they could have all the humanitarian aid they wanted. It's a matter of will, not whether they have a crossing here or there. I'm dealing with Israel, it's a modern state.
I noted this earlier, but I'd like to emphasize this. Other countries can now back up South Africa. They can issue what are called declarations of intervention to the ICJ, saying, we particularly want to recommend this part of South Africa's argument and note these additional facts to back it up. Seems to me that Egypt can and perhaps should go before the court and put forward a declaration saying Israel made these arguments before the court. This is false for this, for X, Y, and Z reasons. There have been about 30 countries that have made statements in support of South Africa, and only about 3 who have said that they will issue declarations of intervention. I don't see why it's not at least 30 and why it couldn't be 100 at this point.
Yeah, and of course, South Africa itself could go to seek affidavits from other countries as well, submit as part of their case and say this is not inaccurate. This is what Egypt says what's going on, but al-Sisi has his own problems in Egypt. And I'm not sure how committed he is to trying to help Palestinians, since Egypt has kind of left him in the lurch for 50 years.
Yeah, I think that, it was South Africa, and I think in part it was South Africa because of the legacy of apartheid, because of the connection between the ANC and the PLO, because of nuclear weapons that were developed and so on. But it is a challenge to every other country to get on the ball and not just give, just hollow rhetoric, at least have some substance behind what you're claiming you're standing for.
Thank you so much. Are there any other questions from the audience? I have a question, Sam. So let's say you're coming out to give a briefing before the ICJ case. What is a question you would ask that they didn't want to answer?
Who the ICJ or Israel?
The American policymakers. Yeah, what would you say? Pretend we're the State Department.
God.
Give us a performance.
They're not taking my questions. It's funny, a question not directly related to this that I've been wanting to ask, and Bruce might like this in particular, is Biden has repeatedly, before as well as after October 7th, said that no Jew is safe anywhere if it wasn't for Israel. And I want to ask, so Jews in the United States are safe because of the existence of a foreign power that itself is an apartheid regime, not because of the First Amendment of the United States or the character of the American people? That's why Jews walking down the street in New York City or Alabama are safe? It's an evisceration of the First Amendment. I'm almost sorry that I said that because I don't want to show my hand for when I finally get a question in, but there you go.
No, it is ridiculous that Israel is the only country, and I spoke to a rabbi about it, that claims that even if you're a Jew in another country and never visited Israel in your whole life, never intend to live there, you don't subscribe to any of the things Israel's doing. Israel claims that they speak for you anyway, that Israel uniquely, whether you like it or not, you're Jew, you're covered by whatever they say. So, okay.
Talk about First Amendment rights.
Yeah, so this is kind of the arrogance, I suppose, that comes from the Zionism, if you will. It's completely contrary to say what the origins of Judaism were about, and that's what makes Israel, I think, is unique on that score. Even if you said Israel, no, I'm never going to go to Israel in my whole life. I don't agree with anything you're doing. I'm a citizen and loyal to the United States of America. Israel still says, but we speak for you. You can't disclaim it. So, that's what we're dealing with. And I don't want at all to insinuate that, that human nature somehow is more angelic in one group as opposed to another. I don't really believe that. I think DNA is the same everywhere, all times, all places, all races, all skins, all ethnicities, all genders. Yeah, the DNA doesn't change. But it means that we all have to try to do the right thing and to minimize injustice. That's why we're on Earth. That's why we have cerebral capabilities. hormonal instincts come when you're born, right? You need food and water. What gives us our status as human beings is our brains, our moral sensitivity, instinctively knowing where there's justice and not, which basically I describe as when you don't have somebody whose station in life determined by two things and two things alone, their character and accomplishments, something's wrong. That's what ought to determine where everybody stands. And that's what we need to work towards. And that's and I think that's true whether we're talking about Gaza, Palestine, Ukraine, Russia, the Uyghurs, and the United States of America as well.
Great, thank you so much. We are heading close to time, so thank you. Do we have one more question? Do we have time for one more question? Is it a good quick one?
Two quick comments, if you don't mind. It's okay? All right. Sam, to your point about the silence of the media, when that ruling came out, it was not reported in the nightly news. And Bruce, to your point as far as enforceability of this, let me tell you about the story and short one. Another event that was organized by our good friend Khalid here back in DC when we had an office there. He invited a congressman and he came with his mother, an old lady, and on the side we're chatting about our inability to get our word out. And that issue is not a politician, but she told me that sue them. They're not gonna lose. That's the whole point. Suing them will become the news. That's what will be reported. So having this ruling and to his point, what is next should not be what's next. It's not a linear process. This should be multiple fronts. This is just one. The question would be what else we can do parallel to this, realistically speaking. But what other things we can do parallel to this?
Thank you so much. The tide is shifting. It's changing.
I'm saying the parallel things is we got to get the United States is the elephant in the living room that tries to resolve this. We have to be more systematic and oppose AIPAC. AIPAC runs Congress on this stuff. I mean, there's not even any hearings. You know, the votes are, and maybe you have 1 or 2 votes against giving the store away to Israel. And part of it is because the United States citizenry is so complacent with the status quo. Okay, there aren't any bad choices. Well, it's not going to change. Of course it's not going to change. You don't do anything. I say, that's why I bring up the idea of William Lloyd Garrison. That's what they told him too in 1833. Slavery is not going to change. Don't worry about it. Why are you doing this? But it did change. It took a long time. It took a lot of resolve. He's not hero-wise. Most people don't know who William Lloyd Garrison is. But I'm surely thankful that somebody like that exists. And he's an inspiration to everybody here trying to change. But that's where we need to, in my judgment, need to focus. Not that we ignore the other platforms. Every platform is useful. But I think that's more useful than the other ones right now because they control the money.
For those of you who don't know, AIPAC is the American Israel Political Action Committee.
Yeah.
It's one of
Public
the
Affairs Committee.
Yeah, Public Affairs. It's one of the most powerful PACs in Congress. You can search who is being funded by AIPAC. John Mearsheimer writes extensively about it. So also my college professor.
The book is called The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Waltz.
Yeah.
Stephen Waltz was at Harvard. He taught me there.
Yes.
But that's conclusive. I mean, it's carrying coals to Newcastle to add anything more. It's conclusive. I mean, in AIPAC, we're talking about serious money, well over $100 million a year that they spend, and they go after anybody. I had breakfast today with Thomas Massey, Kentucky, and they have a big campaign against him because he's one of the few who said, no, I'm not voting a single dollar for Israel. We need that money for the United States. And so AIPAC now is targeted him.
Should I say a word about media?
Sure, yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the paltry coverage given to the ICJ decision is another huge piece of evidence as to the ridiculous bias of the major media, and it also should compel us to wake up to trying to build independent media as much as possible. And, you know, I'm sort of doing a chicken and egg thing. I mean, when I get into the State Department, you know, if I get them to take my question, that means I get 1 million views on Twitter, you know, and that you know, an insight that I have reaches, you know, a hell of a lot more people than if I just write that insight. So we have to, given this ridiculous media terrain of the traditional gatekeepers and big tech, which is, you know, in the case of Twitter, it's slanted, I was saying to have it. In the case of Facebook, it's a wall in terms of getting real critical information out. And we just have to be creative in overcoming those obstacles. And people here in DC, we have a unique opportunity. You know, there have been all these protests, for example, but they typically take place on a Saturday. Well, I'm sorry to report, none of the decision makers are in those buildings on a Saturday. And, you know, maybe those activist organizations, and also, I mean, some of them you had Jewish Voice for Peace, you know, crash the Capitol and spring their head off at the Capitol. But these structures have to develop. You know, we can't be AIPAC, but maybe we can be more, you know, active in terms of getting in the face of people in Congress in a way that's not totally confrontational, not screaming, but maybe that has a place. And maybe it has a place on weekdays to be in front of strategic buildings, that there are groups that do that and hand out flyers on, you know, weekdays to get that information out if the media is not going to report it. So I think it's just using every moment, every opportunity, every crevice that you can in order to get the critical information and move things in a positive direction.
Code Pink is there every day.
Yeah, they are. But, you know, I feel like Code Pink sometimes, you know, people just say, okay, the Code Pink's doing it. And I think a lot of different voices have to do it. I think the American Muslim community and the American community are sometimes too reserved because they sort of don't want to, you know, get down and dirty in a way. And I think they've got to find their voice more along those lines.
I've seen teachers against genocide going there, and I saw doctors against genocide going there. And don't forget the young lady.
Yes,
Hazani, she's doing amazing.
In front of Blinken's house, no less.
Wow, they are camping
Right.
this
There's certainly
weekend.
that.
So I mean, there is a lot. But I
There
mean,
is.
for me, I'm going there sometimes, you know, and there is I don't see the presence of can I say Palestinian presence in the Senate, in the Congress, like trying to talk to them, to express their views. I don't see this. I see Code Pink always, and amazing what they are doing, and they are speaking in our name, speaking in the Palestinian, you know, in our name. And sometimes I feel so like down. Why I don't see people from our community going there and talking? You know, I'm not political. I don't understand politics that much, but at least I can talk from my heart. I can talk about what's the people, you know, the suffering of our people in Gaza, because we are here in the States. We are here in the States in the most, you know, strong, like we say, I mean, they do the veto, they can do so many things, America. So if we don't take this opportunity of us being here in the States and try, and especially in Washington, D.C., and try to interact with the people in the Congress and the Senate, what's the use of us being here? Just, you know, and this is what really make me feel sometimes disappointed, let's say, from our community. Are they afraid of going there and show up, you know? I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, we did have the gentleman earlier talking about, you know, mass, you know, really well organized calling in, and I think that's excellent. But I think that there are so many other avenues as well.
It's changing. The landscape is changing. Even Code Pink, they do have Palestinians. I was with them 2 days ago on the Hill. They have Palestinians who go with them, young, old, and don't say you're not political. Nobody's political in these groups. Just show up, join the groups, go to rallies, call, and anything. There's so many groups and networks. You just have to just get up there and do it.
Thank you so much. It can be very simple. Bring a friend and go. You know, or when you're drinking tea and having chai and having cake, talk about it. Grab their hand and just go. There's so much political activism in DC and elsewhere throughout the country. So thank you so much for your activism. I was informed that your ride is here, so so we're gonna have to wrap this up. But thank you both so much for coming and hosting this event and having this very insightful discussion. I learned a lot and I feel very motivated.
Well, I just want to say the real heroes are out there in Kali. Now, you're the ones, you make America. That's how this works. It's never a one-man show. We all hang together, we all hang separately. That's how we won the revolution. That's how we're going to succeed.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You can't catch